Welcome to the Bucknuts Happy Hour. This is your, we'll call it your most fun Ohio State podcast. I don't know how many, I know there's a lot of them out there. I don't know how many of them out there crack beers and talk Buckeyes the way we do. We try and do it a little differently here. I am here in New York City, Patrick Murray from Bucknuts and 247 Sports. We're here to cover the Heisman Trophy celebration this weekend. We'll really dive into that in this podcast. We're going to talk some college football playoff. We should have Bill Kurlick on in the second half of the show to talk some Buckeye recruiting. Obviously, the early signing period coming up here. But let's dive into Buckeyes and what's been the latest with the Buckeyes. And to do that, we're going to bring in our regular attender of the Bucknuts Happy Hour, Timmy Hall from 97.1 The Fan. Tim, thanks for joining us again. What you got there?
Oh, hello. Sorry. Just caught me mid-sip there, Patrick. I was just enjoying a little 3 o'clock happy hour here for the Buckeye Happy Hour. We've got a Rogue Hazelnut Brown Nectar. You'll be pleased to know that I also had my first winter ale of the season today. So checked it off the list. And, of course, it's the traditional. It's the GOAT of Christmas beers, the Great Lakes Christmas Ale. So, and I had it on draft too. And I had it at a golf club. I didn't take the sticks, but just to have an off day, you're welcome for doing this on an off day too. I even recorded one of my own podcasts. It didn't really feel like an off day, but I did get to go and sit there and have lunch at a golf club and have a Great Lakes Christmas Ale on draft. So it was unbelievable. There were people out there playing. I would have. I think 45 to 50 degrees with low winds, perfect temps to get out there and swing them, man.
Sure, why not? I mean, I don't know much about golf, but that sounds good to me. We got here. I had to hurry, change in the hotel room, and get down to the Heisman Trophy candidate interviews. And so I sent Sarah, my girlfriend, to buy beer. She got a Brooklyn Brewery winter IPA, so I think she's very excited being in New York. Yeah.
Good.
I don't know if I've ever opened one on camera here before, but I did it today. Actually, I think I did once when we were in Chicago.
So you're staying local. You got the Brooklyn Brewing Company. I've had a couple of theirs. I think I've had their Golden Lager or whatever their summertime ale is. That's a pretty good play. That's good. I like it. I mean, you go and visit a city. You're in New York. Try to do like the New Yorkers do. And yeah, I appreciate that.
And it is pretty good. I'll give Sarah credit on this one. So if she decides to listen to this, she will hear that she was brought up. Sometimes she listens, sometimes she doesn't. I can't really control what she does. But speaking of things out of our control, let's talk about this Heisman Trophy race, or this Heisman Trophy announcement that'll come on Saturday. We're recording this on Friday afternoon. I just talked with 3 of the 4. I did not make it to Max Duggan, but I did talk to CJ Stroud. I did talk to Caleb Williams. I did talk to Stetson Bennett. Timmy, first, real quick, walking off the elevator here, and this is part of the reason I like to come to this. This is only my second time, but walking off the elevator here, the old ball coach was getting on the elevator. The elevator opened. I was like, that looks really familiar. And then as the elevator closed, I was like, oh, that's Steve Spurrier. So, a lot of people in town for the Heisman, I imagine. But anyway,
how is Spurrier? Hold on. How is Spurrier in an elevator? Does he talk too much? I mean, you expect an elevator to be a little bit faster.
I was getting off and he was getting on, but he did say to no one in particular as he got on an empty elevator, going up, and then the doors closed. And it was really the voice. That's when I put 2 and 2 together that like, oh yeah, that's why I recognize him.
Tim May is the college football writer version of Steve Spurrier, our colleague 100%. Tim May. Is that a good comparison? Just sort of the cadence, their accents, just sort of what all they're giving, what all they're putting out, like way more than you would ever need, right? Like you could, Tim, it's like we love you, man, but like he could stop after like his third thought, and we'd be filled with so much information. I love Tim May, by the way. That's a compliment because Steve Spurrier is a iconic college football coach. I still will never forget, I don't know, Patrick, you cover Buckeye basketball like I do, and it's neat in that sport and that you'll get a few more opportunities throughout the season to see some visitors come in. It's way more games than in a football season. So like when Syracuse came to town, I wanted to make sure that I had a credential for that just so I could be in the post-game press conference room to hear a guy like Jim Boeheim speak and just kind of see what he's like. I had seen him before just in covering some ACC hoops, but it had been a while. And when Coach K comes over, coaches like that. So I take you back to when I was younger in the biz, and I was covering a game in South Carolina when the old ball coach was there. And that was neat. Got like an overnight stay. We did a bunch of coverage around a game. It was actually Russell Wilson's first ever college football game. It was NC State at South Carolina. I will never forget just how Steve Spurrier just carried the room, and almost like a comedian that was working a set, right? But this is something that he could do in his sleep. He had done 6,000 of these in his career. And the story of that game was NC State was so bad, and of course Russell turned out okay. They didn't even cross midfield, I don't think, until the fourth quarter, and it was 31-0. It was just a joke of a game, and Spurrier almost couldn't help himself. I remember him saying, answering a question like, "Coach, like, how do you story this game? First game of the season, how do you think you did? Shutout win, but did you get everything you want?" He's like, we're gonna have some things to work on. I mean, let's be honest about it. They're not too good over there, so they got a long way to go. But holding them to 0 points, pretty good. But offense gonna have to pick it up a little bit more, and a lot of third downs we missed. Just the fact that he kind of nonchalantly threw out there, they're not too good. It was just no one stopped on the fact that the coach just said, "Yeah, those guys not too good right now, so we should beat them." Everybody's so complimentary and has to be so respectful to the opponent. Spurrier was really not that way, but because of the way he talks and the way he is, nobody even picked up on it. Nobody noticed it. So we just did an entire podcast on Steve Spurrier. There we go.
You got to love those. It's like your grandpa or somebody who like says the wrong thing at Thanksgiving or Christmas or whatever holiday, but no one mentions it because it's the old guy in the room. So you just let him talk, right? You just let him say whatever needs to be said in his mind.
Well, he's allowed to, because he's won the Heisman and he's won a national championship, and we're trying to get Ryan Day to that spot. So Ryan Day can sit around any table he's at, and he could talk and talk and talk, and nobody could ever shut him up.
I don't think Ryan Day's winning a Heisman. I don't think at this point in his
no, career, but I'll go for a national championship. I'll go for that.
That would be a good. Yeah, I think he would too. CJ Stroud is a guy who could win the Heisman, though I don't think either of us. Well, I mean, he's here, so he can, but I don't think.
I guess sort of. Yeah.
Right. I mean, look, let's be real here. I think everyone expects Caleb Williams to walk away with this award. I tweeted out 2 weeks ago when he was balling during the USC UCLA game that I think he pretty much locked it up then. And then, CJ had a good game against Michigan until throwing those late picks, but I don't think it was enough to put him over what Caleb Williams did. Even in an injured loss in the Pac-12 championship game, I mean, he still looked impressive. And if you look at the numbers, they're pretty good too. So if you didn't even watch the game and you're a Heisman voter, how big of a deal is it? CJ Stroud's the first guy in Ohio State history to be invited to the Heisman Trophy ceremony back-to-back years. 2 years, which is insane because they have the only two-time winner. But I learned this year that they didn't used to have a ceremony, and they didn't used to have multiple finalists. So in your mind, just how big of a deal is that for Ohio State and CJ Stroud? But the fact that he's probably going to lose both years, how do you kind of evaluate this? Because this is the end. It's not like last year where we were talking about, okay, CJ could be back next year and win the whole thing. He's going to the NFL. We know that, even if he hasn't said it. So how do you kind of evaluate the fact that, yes, he's been here twice to New York, but he is more than likely going to not win either time?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think that the program is still going in the right direction, and Ohio State continues to solidify itself now under Ryan Day and the way that he runs his offense, that he can pick quarterbacks and he can get them up to speed quickly, whether they're sitting for a year or two behind somebody else. And then when they take over as QB1, these guys are some of the best quarterbacks in college football. The last thing that they've got to prove is that they happen to be the best overall player in college football in a given year, as decided by the voters. And we know it all comes down to the voters. And just because you win the Heisman doesn't necessarily mean everyone agrees you're the best college football player. We know there's politics that go into every single award that gets doled out there. I can remember us seeing Sean Wade after, and we wouldn't deny it, had a very suspect season and still wound up as a first team all Big Ten cornerback. And we all had eyes and saw how that year went. It was kind of reminiscent of what Denzel Burke put out there this season. But you can't say that this is a bad thing, man. I mean, he's not going to win, okay? It's hard to win the Heisman Trophy. I mean, you've got to be –
does it?
Yeah, you've got to be one of the more perfect players from start to finish. And while it's a little disappointing in that this college football season did sort of open itself up to even more so have a guy like CJ Stroud win. I mean, if you listen to me early on in the season, I was completely on board. I mean, I would have bet close to the house that CJ Stroud was winning this award and nobody else. And you look at the numbers of the other guys in the race, it is a little bit disappointing and deflating that CJ's not going to win it, that Stroud in the stats department took a step back. And I guess, when it's all said and done, he didn't take as big of a step forward from last year to this year as I would have liked. He kept it, while his numbers went down, I still think he kept it pretty much on an even plane. They lost one less game. The Oregon game was right at the beginning of his run. And I know he was dealing with a little bit of an injury. So you want to allow a grace period for that, for an early season loss. And it was against a pretty good opponent at the time with the Ducks, but it's disappointing. But overall, it still shows that the guy that's at the helm of this offense here is going to be in a really good position, and they're being developed. And also the guys that are being selected to quarterback this offense are very, very good recruits, 4- and 5-star talents. And I think that's overall a positive thing. So it's always something that you can cycle back into recruiting, and it's just like putting it on the poster board for, the next guy. And I think maybe the more interesting discussion, Pat, besides the question of, how do you look at that 2 straight Heisman finalists for your QB, is what's coming next. And you really have to go back a long way for the last quarterback dud, and however you would quantify that or however you would define that. But, plain and simply, a QB that really did not work out. I mean, I know we would have liked CJ to be better and beat Michigan and throw for 45 or 50 touchdowns, but he's a fine quarterback. He's a top 2 or 3 quarterback in college football this year, and one of the better throwers we've ever seen at Ohio State. But how long has it been since we've had a dud? And just the little bit of nervousness, because we don't seem to be hearing as much about Devin Brown or Kyle McCord as we did with CJ. There seemed to be not a guarantee, but a lot of positive vibes that CJ would definitely be a really good starting quarterback when he got the job. And I don't think we're hearing that as much about either Devin or Kyle McCord. And we know that there's a transfer portal that's wide open in college football as well. And so it leads you to wonder, but I mean, you got to go back. I mean, who do you have to go back to? Zwick, possibly, or Bowserman for the last dud of a QB at Ohio State?
I would say, Todd Beckman was okay.
Beckman? Yeah.
There was that Penn. Yeah, I mean, he was good. He just came out that year and didn't play well against USC, and they turned the ball over to Terrell Pryor, which makes sense. I mean, the year before that, after he beat Penn State, they were talking about him for the Heisman. He didn't make it, but so maybe even before that, maybe to, like you said, Bowserman or Zwick. I do think you've got 2 good ones in Kyle McCord and Devin Brown, and you've got Dylan Raiola in the pipeline coming here, not too far from. So I'm going to have Bill Kurlick hopefully on here after you, and I'm going to talk to him about their quarterback recruiting, because they don't have a 2023 commit right now, and they certainly want to have somebody in there. But I think, from what we've seen of Devin Brown, or from what we've seen of Kyle McCord, I thought he looked good last year as a freshman when he started for CJ Stroud. Only played a half. And things that I've heard, you're right, it hasn't been talked about as much, but I think that's because CJ's just been so steady. I don't think there's going to be any issues down the pipeline. I'll just put it that way. I think they're in good hands going forward.
I think too, like what do you consider the line to be? Because we know that there might be a chance that not every quarterback going forward here for Ryan Day is going to be going after 40 touchdown pass seasons. It could look a little bit different. I mean, you can talk me into a number of different ways to win football games. And if it looks a little bit more like how Georgia is doing it, and that proves to be the better recipe to win more national championships with a stingier defense as opposed to just big numbers from the quarterback, like those big numbers could be spread about over multiple running backs, right? I mean, I know that's a little bit of a shift from the way that we're seeing it right now with the wide receiver talent. But I wonder how that would always look. Like we are in this mode where 40 to 50 touchdown passes is the expectation. And that's a big ask. And CJ hadn't hit that yet this year after doing it last season. And what did Justin Fields do? 41 touchdown passes with 3 picks. And then he added 10 rushing touchdowns in that season. I mean, 51 touchdowns. It's incredible what these guys are doing as Ohio State quarterbacks. So you almost have to brace yourself that you could have a good quarterback, and that might be 27 touchdowns. I feel like 25 touchdowns is the bare minimum. With the talent that you have and the receivers, that's the minimum. And then if you limit turnovers and if you provide a great threat to run and it's a balanced offense, you got a couple of great running backs and you're running the ball like a wild man back there, then that would be fine with me. But you just wonder what it's going to look like from year to year.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you keep Ryan Day and you keep Brian Hartline, I can't imagine it changing too much, right? Because one is the head coach who's a quarterback by nature, and the other is bringing in top wide receivers. So, unless you really miss on a quarterback and you don't have a backup that you can trust to go into the game, because that's the thing. I mean, look at Clemson. When as soon as the quarterbacks stopped being elite year after year after year, they fell off the map under DJ Ungogolai. So they haven't been the same program. I think if you're Ohio State, you have a little bit more assurance there with some of the other offensive pieces. But you're right, the defense, we saw it be better this year, but it's not Georgia level defense. I mean, even statistically. So yeah, I think this is kind of the way that you're going to be with those guys that I mentioned here. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think you can win national championships that way. But you do need both sides of the ball playing well. You need to win the big games, which has been the difference for Ohio State these last 2 years. And they're going to get a shot. They still are in the playoff this year. I think people keep forgetting that when they're that Michigan game still is such a bitter taste in people's mouths that I think being in the playoff hasn't been as exciting as maybe it should. Do you get that sense?
It's exciting. I mean, let me tell you that to come from where you were losing that game to Michigan, there's a little bit of there's going to continue to be a little bit of a letdown when we discuss that team up north, because you've lost 2 straight games to them. But the idea is that you're still competing for a national championship. It's an extra jolt to the end of this college football season. How could you disagree? And the fact that if you are going to possibly face Michigan, you will have beaten a 13-0 defending national champion. And we've talked about this before. How could you not gain a bunch of confidence as a team? Like, there's no way you're going to beat Georgia and then not think that you will beat Michigan after it, Right. So, they're going to the coaches and the players, they will be a confident bunch. And you just hope that is true confidence. That doesn't allow them to, if they do beat Georgia, that confidence that fills up inside them doesn't take away from their focus and everything that they have to do to go out there and execute and win the game. Because the rah-rah stuff, the being passionate and all that, that's good. But then there comes a point where you have to settle down and then execute and get to the task at hand and make sure that you script it better, coach it better, and follow through better than that last game, or else that would be a huge disaster, man.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I'm going to get into some of the Ohio State, Georgia stuff once you get out of here. But
let me leave you with this, because the one thing that I'm curious about that I mentioned maybe a time or two in the last month is I stumbled on the clip from last year where Aiden Hutchinson was giving his speech or doing his interview with those guys on stage, and CJ, of course, was there, and they're all dressed to the nines like you do for this thing, and Desmond Howard steps in with that just horrible line to CJ about not getting the protection from his offensive line or whatever, because Aiden said something about, we wanted to, win the division and beat Ohio State, obviously. And then the guy's like, trying to like drum it up and make something more out of it. It's just a dude talking about his season. I just wonder what, if anything, Desmond Howard is going to say or do up there to rub it in again to CJ. And I feel bad about that. I wonder if he'll have any response, or I don't know. It's like the thing that I'm looking for tonight is.
Did you see Desmond on Twitter kind of defending that whole thing this week?
You mean last year or this week?
He was on Twitter. It came up and he quote tweeted somebody talking about it. And then he went back and forth with a number of people. Steve Hellwagon, my colleague, was in on it. Yeah, if you go back through Desmond's Twitter feed, it was within the last couple of days, came up. And basically he said, he's talked to CJ. They're cool. It was just some fun type of thing. And obviously Ohio State people got after him pretty good on there. And yeah. If you haven't seen that on Twitter, go back. Find Desmond's tweet. It won't be hard to find. It's just a couple days old. But
it's fine that you and CJ are good, Desmond. Like, I can appreciate that. I'm sure you could be, but it still doesn't take away from the fact that it was in poor taste to put him on the spot like that on national TV when it's a night to have your moment, and you had to put him down like that in front of everybody. Like, you had the power in that situation. It was just a shitty thing to do.
I agree. Not the time. If you want to make Michigan jokes, there are other places to do that. But Desmond is Desmond, and I don't dislike as much as people do, but I did not think that was the right situation for those things. Good to bring that up though, because that was a weird one. I remember sitting in the room that they have us sit in, because we're not actually at the ceremony when we cover this thing, watching on TV just like everyone else does. They're pumping the sound in. And like there was this just kind of moment when he said that. So,
I know. I gotta go, Pat. I gotta pick the kid up from school here.
Kids are ruining all my plans today. I was gonna have Brandon Beam on, him and his wife, who are expecting, had a doctor's appointment. Yeah. We were gonna talk World Cup soccer instead of football. Yeah. So I guess people probably are happy that he didn't come on. But
that pesky fetus, Pat, you got to take care of it.
All right. Thanks, Timmy. I appreciate it. Yes. You're a loyal happy hour attendee.
See you, buddy.
All right. See you later. And that was Timmy Hall, who, as you guys know, if you've been paying attention to the show, one of my good friends, someone who I think does a great job on the fan, and it's been great helping out here. I want to go back to the Heisman just because we did get done with interviews here just a little bit ago and touch on just kind of some things that stood out to me. I think it's interesting. I asked CJ Stroud about last year with Aiden Hutchinson being there, this year with Stetson Bennett, Georgia's quarterback, being there. How do those interactions go when you just played a guy in a huge game like Aiden Hutchinson and got beat? This year, you're playing Stetson Bennett, the number one team in the quarterback, the number one team in the country, and you're play that in the big game of the season, the college football playoff semifinal, a chance to play in the national championship on the line. And he said, we're just people, man. I mean, I think that's almost verbatim what he said to me. He was like, that stuff doesn't come up. He was like, I was cool with Aiden. He's like, I don't really know Stetson. We've only been together for a little bit here. They just got into New York this afternoon, but that everything was cool. And I do think that there's this sense from fans that there's just this always tension, especially Ohio State, Michigan. And I think there certainly is some of that, but it was interesting to me that CJ, we're just guys. And then I asked Stetson Bennett about CJ Stroud, and he said he hasn't watched a ton of him just because he's been focused on Georgia and the SEC. But he talked about what an accurate passer he was, and the way he can just put the ball where the receiver needs to catch the ball to be able to then gain more yards, something that he admires about CJ's game. Let's remember, Stetson Bennett is a former walk-on quarterback who is now a national champion and has a chance to win another one. So an interesting dynamic between those two quarterbacks that are going to face each other. Talked to Caleb Williams a little bit too. He was asked about CJ Stroud, whom he said he's met a couple of times, including at a camp last summer that they were at out in Southern California, and just talked about what CJ's able to do as a passer as well. So from his colleagues, from the guys that are also Heisman Trophy finalists this year, a lot of respect for CJ Stroud. And obviously those guys aren't going to get up there and say anything that, is going to grab headlines, especially then up against CJ Stroud. But I get the sense that Caleb Williams and Stroud have somewhat of a friendship, especially now Caleb Williams being at USC, basically in the backyard of where CJ Stroud is from. So interesting, just kind of perspective on how these guys all view each other, because they are people. And I think we kind of forget that at some point in time. Speaking of this college football playoff matchup, I do think, and I said this to Timmy earlier, I do think that the fact that the Buckeyes are back in the playoff, obviously didn't make it last year, some of the shine of that has come off. And I say this talking to people on our boards, people on social media, and even friends of mine that are Buckeye fans. Just that I think people forget that Ohio State, as of just a few weeks ago, was the team everyone was talking about as the only team that could hang with Georgia, could possibly beat Georgia, clearly the number one or the number two team in the country, and you lose to Michigan. And obviously that has an effect on it, no doubt about it. But there's also a part of it that you have to realize is fourth quarter, it's a 4-point game against Michigan. Yeah, you let the game get out of hand. You let it get out of hand quickly, and that has to be taken into account. But, as bad as that final score was, if Ohio State scores touchdowns instead of kicking field goals in the first half, if Ohio State finishes drives in the first half, that may be a blowout the other way. You can look at it a number of different ways. I just think it's important when you're thinking of this college football playoff game, because it is such a big game, to remember that this is still very good. And I haven't fully broken down Georgia. I haven't made any sort of prediction on that game at this point in time, but I do think that there's this thought that Ohio State has become this, they backdoored their way into the playoff, but maybe a little bit undeserving of. I don't think that's true at all. This in my mind is still the second most talented, maybe third most talented. Alabama probably should be in that conversation too, even though they didn't make the playoff. But you have the second or third most talented roster in the country going up against another top 3 talented roster. I think that should be a good football game. I don't expect, unless when I go back and really watch Georgia, I see things that I didn't see when I watched them throughout the season. I don't expect that I will, even if I do pick Georgia to win, I can't imagine it being some sort of blowout. And I think a lot of people think that, especially nationally, maybe not Buckeye fans, but I still think this Ohio State team is really good. And you give them a month to get healthy, almost a month to game plan differently. And you hope that Ryan Day looks at the film and evaluates his own play calling, and Jim Knowles does the same on the defensive side of the ball. I think that I like Buckeyes get this shot, and I like that you're number 4 seed now and you're playing the number 1 team, because you're gonna go after them. If you were playing TCU, if things had gone differently and Ohio State beat Michigan, I still think they probably win, but I think just kind of motivation is a little different. Anyway, we're gonna flip the switch. We've got early signing periods started, so I wanted to talk some recruiting, which is something that I don't do a ton of, but we have a guy who does in Bill Kurlick. Bill, thanks for joining the happy hour. How you doing today?
Doing okay. How are you, Pat?
Good. Did you get a refrigerator? Question number 1.
Not yet, unfortunately.
Backstory here. We were originally going to do this at noon. Travel plans of mine changed that to getting out to New York. And Bill calls me and says, well, our refrigerator broke and we have to go get a new refrigerator. We've got water all over the floor. So actually worked out better. So I'm glad it worked out. I hope the refrigerator things figure themselves out. But
We're
let's talk
working on
about
it.
better. All right, good. Let's talk Buckeye recruiting, because that's probably not as stressful as buying a new refrigerator. One thing that just before you came on, Tim Hall and I were about future at quarterback for Ohio State. And obviously, you've got Kyle McCord, got Devin Brown, you've got Dylan Raiola coming. Where do the Buckeyes stand in terms of a 2023 quarterback? I know there was a commitment. There's not a commitment. There is at least one person that they're interested in. What can you tell us about the possibility next guy in the pipeline?
Well, the guy right now would be Lincoln Kienholz from the great state of South Dakota, Pierre Riggs High School. I'm certainly sure that most of Buckeye Nation is well aware of all the high schools in South Dakota. Not exactly your typical place for Ohio State to recruit, but this kid's a really good one. I mean, he led his team to a state championship this year. Not the first time he's won a state championship, but had a great season, 12-0. Is committed still to Washington at this point, but Ohio State's working on him. He made an official visit for the Michigan game. That went well enough that Ohio State is still in the running to flip him from Washington. Corey Dennis was visiting with him yesterday on Thursday, and Lincoln's going to have to make a decision. Does he want to stay with Washington, or does he want to flip to Ohio State? Really, you don't know which way that's going to go right now. I'm not sure that Lincoln knows what he's going to do for sure at this point. I think he's still contemplating both options, and he'll maybe come to a decision before the start of the early signing period, but that's not a given. He's thinking he would like to decide and sign in the early signing period, but he's not going to be an early grad, so he doesn't have to do that. If he's not sure, he'll carry it on. So we'll see.
So this isn't the case of Ohio State just finding a quarterback to fill a class. This is a kid who you think could come in here and eventually play and perform. Correct?
Yeah,
I'm reading you.
Yeah, he'll come in to compete. I mean, if he does become a Buckeye, he'll have a legitimate chance to at some point be the Buckeye starting quarterback. He's not just a body out there, so to speak, whatsoever. They really do need to get a quarterback either via scholarship 2023 guy or the transfer portal. They really do need to get another quarterback. I think we all fully expect, we know pretty much, I think, that CJ Stroud's not coming back to Ohio State next year. Yeah. That would leave Kyle McCord and of course, Devin Brown to battle it out. And you really need to have 3 scholarship quarterbacks on the roster minimum. So we'll see what happens. And even if Lincoln Kienholz would flip to Ohio State, I think they would still try to get another guy for the roster. It might not necessarily be, maybe it's a preferred walk-on, maybe it's a transfer portal guy. But I think they would even then perhaps like to get another guy for the roster.
I was going to ask if there was a possibility that they do look in the portal for a quarterback. What would be, in your mind, what are they looking for there? Because as you said, they do have 2 guys they're confident in Kyle McCord and Devin Brown. Are they looking for, a guy that can just come in, be a body in that sense? Or do they think they need a third guy to really come in and compete if they were to hit the portal?
I think they want a guy that could play. I mean, if your starter gets injured, and that certainly can happen, and you're down to one guy, you're in trouble. I mean, you are then, if the starter's out, you're a sprained ankle away from going with who knows who if you don't have a scholarship quarterback on the roster. So 3 scholarship type quarterbacks with that kind of ability to be a scholarship guy on the roster, very, very important.
Well, it worked out for Georgia and Stetson Bennett. So, maybe that's the way to go. Former walk-on quarterback, leaves the program, comes back, win a national championship. It seems pretty simple formula to me.
Yeah.
If you're looking for spots in the upcoming class that are still up for grabs, I know defensive end is one that everyone's very interested in. I know there's a handful of guys that could fill that role in this class. Of the sort of big three, and then I know Joshua Mickens is also in there, but not necessarily in the same mold. What is your read kind of situation at that position?
Well, I continue to feel confident that Joshua Mickens will be a Buckeye. He hasn't committed yet. He certainly, though, I just continue to feel good that he's going to end up at Ohio State. He's an Indiana kid. Obviously, Ohio State is relatively close to home, big-time football. He's capable of playing at the Ohio State level. He's a very good player. And he would come in, if he does, in the jack position that, you see Jack Sawyer out there, no pun intended. But that same position is what Joshua Mickens would be looking at. Now, they do still have the defensive ends. Keon Keeley, I've said for quite some time, I really think that ship has sailed. I expect him to end up at Alabama. Mateo Uyungale came out yesterday with his 3 schools that he's going to move forward. It's kind of his final 3. Ohio State's on that list: Ohio State, USC, and Oregon. At one point, I really felt like Ohio State had the slight lead. I don't know now. He keeps things so well guarded. He does not say a lot about that. I think Ohio State is still in the mix, but I think it's not going to be easy. Obviously, USC has had a really good season, much better than they've had recently. That is certainly close to home for him. Oregon is not too far from home for him. And then you've got Ohio State. So I don't count the Buckeyes out there. I just certainly would not be ready to crystal ball him to Ohio State. Then you've got Damon Wilson. Both Georgia and Ohio State made their home visits the last few days. Ryan Day made his home visit. There's a lot of pessimism on the Ohio State side of things. It seems that he's not going to end up at Ohio State. And I will totally agree. This has been trending Georgia, but I'm not ready to get on that one quite yet. The NIL is a factor there, as it always is. Ohio State is not going to go and lay down a $1 million NIL offer to him. But from when he visited Ohio State, and Ohio State has presented a good situation for him, NIL-wise down the road. Georgia, they've trended and they can come in and it seems like they have topped that situation. Could Ohio State somehow figure out a way to change that thinking? I'm not ruling it out yet. Let's just say that they really want him. And until I firmly feel that they're not going to get him, I'm just not ruling that out for Ohio State.
You mentioned the NIL there, and that's been a topic the last couple of days. Gene Smith put out a kind of call to action to people to donate to the collectives. Ohio State, if you haven't paid attention to this, people who are listening, watching, Ohio State is trying to play by these rules that they think are going to exist. And right now there's just no rules with NIL, and schools getting away with a lot of things that Ohio State, from my understanding, views as incendiary, still kind of dirty. So, Bill, in your mind, how big of a deal has NIL become these last 2 years in recruiting? Obviously, Ohio State's still recruiting at a high level, but it seems like we're hearing more about that in past years probably would have been Buckeyes, but now are looking at schools that are willing to push the limits with the NIL. Am I reading that right?
Yeah, I think, it really depends on, as far as how big a deal, it depends on the individual player. Okay. Ohio State's got a lot of great players in the last couple of recruiting classes with the NIL as it is now. They still got a lot of great players. What I kind of, you mentioned the rules, and that's the big problem. There really aren't any rules that are, exactly, being set down and then enforced by the NCAA, and that's the problem. I talk to college coaches, and they're just begging, so to speak, give us the rules that we can all play by the same rules. And pessimistically, I have to say, I don't think that that's necessarily coming in the next year or so. I don't know that the NCAA is going to do that. I've not had a college coach tell me they feel confident the NCAA is going to do it. They just want that to happen. So we'll see. You can get players without putting down that type of a deal or whatever. It's just more difficult. I posted on our message board this afternoon. I could name 2 kids in the last couple of weeks that recruiters spent a lot of time recruiting them, and they had committed to a certain school, and then all of a sudden a big NIL deal is put down in front of them, and they flip. And that's tough to live by if you're a recruiter. So, we'll see what happens. I just wish they would get something that everyone could live by and make this fair. And I'm not sure that all these big money deals, are going to turn out to be what these kids think they are necessarily, nor Texas A&M. We know what happened with their supposedly bought recruiting class. Well, things have kind of fallen apart there. So, we'll kind of see what happens as things move on here.
You mentioned the Texas A&M, and that's where I was going to go next, because it kind of leads into the transfer portal era as well. And a lot of these Texas A&M freshmen have either already entered the transfer portal, or a lot of people think they're going to. You're seeing it across the country. Kids are – the transfer portal, I think, in the first day that it was technically open, had over 350 kids before noon, I think, and that was just FBS level. When you look at the transfer portal and how it's changed recruiting from Ohio State's perspective, I know Ryan Day has been very adamant that they will still recruit high school kids, and that is the primary focus. But do you see any – obviously, Ohio State's used the transfer portal to great effect. Do you see Ohio State using it more when you see successes of programs like, Alabama has used it really well? USC has turned their entire program around in 1 year. Does Ohio State need to use the transfer portal more? Will they use transfer portal more in your mind?
I don't think there's going to be a big change. I think they'll maybe a little more aggressively look at it, but I don't think there's going to be a big change. Ohio State's got a talented roster, and you've got to bring somebody in that's going to really help that roster. That player's got to be really good, and in those cases, the kid already has a pretty good situation most of the time. He's already an established starter at a very good high level. And how many offensive linemen are out there, for instance, in the portal right now that are truly capable of coming in and starting for Ohio State? Not a lot of them. And I think a lot of kids are finding that the grass isn't always greener on the other side. If you look at it, a lot of these kids don't go somewhere and have the impact that they think they thought they were going to have when they got into the portal. Over 1,000 kids were in that portal on the first day. By the end of the first day, well over 1,000. And a lot of those kids are going to end up going down to a lesser school or even a lesser level. Some of them are going to have to go down to the Division II level, for instance. So I think as time goes on, and I know some kids that got in the portal, went to a new school, and they have let kids at their old school know, hey, I'd be cautious about doing this. The grass isn't always greener on the other side.
Sure. And I think from a fan perspective, I
was just going to say, for every Justin Fields out there that got in the transfer portal and immediately it was a big time, player that Ohio State got, or a Jonah Jackson a number of years ago started right away. And for every one of those guys, there's a number of them that don't have that kind of success.
I think it's important to, from a fan perspective, look, everyone's always interested in the new freshman, right? That's what it used to be. The star freshman coming in, everyone was excited about that guy because he's new. It's something you haven't seen before. Even the talented players on the current roster are guys you've seen and you know what to expect. And so the transfer portal just enhances that from a fan perspective. I also think it's important to point out Day is very much, and his staff are very much about the right fit for their culture. And oftentimes guys that enter the transfer portal, there's more than just, hey, there was a better guy in front of you, but you're still really good. Right? There were probably some reason why that kid was playing at their school. So doing your homework on the kid to make sure it's a right fit is as important as anything, just like they do in recruiting. But you have a little bit more time to mold a kid coming out of high school. But I still think it's important for what Ohio State wants to do going forward. So I guess my next question to you would be, where, if anywhere, do you see Ohio State tapping into the portal position-wise?
Well, before I answer that, I want to kind of take a step slightly back. There were two kids that came up in the portal recently, last few days, that Ohio State fans were clamoring, hey, Ohio State's going to go after this kid or that kid. They were involved with this or that kid when they were in high school. Well, Ohio State did not go after those kids. They, now that they're in the portal, they said, no, thanks. They're not going after those kids. Now, there's some that they're interested in. Sure. I mean, we know that they've been interested in the cornerback, Fentrell Cypress, who's at Virginia. Have had some interest in Deshaun McCullough, but other kids, they've kind of passed on them and said, we're not going to do that. That we don't think that is the right fit, or is kids good enough to start here or whatever, but they're not going to go in that direction. So, not just because somebody is maybe quote a big time kid, Ohio State may not go after that kid. And in most cases, they're not going to go after these guys. Again, they've got a talented roster and they don't have a lot of open spots. They've got 19 commitments. So there's 19 spots being taken up off the roster. So there's just not a lot of open spots. And they're trying really, really hard, and they've done a good job of it, of keeping the guys on the roster at Ohio State and out of that portal, so to speak.
Yeah, I know that's obviously a focus of the staff this offseason. They did have some guys leave last year. They've already had a couple guys enter the portal so far this season. Obviously, things are a little different this season. You're going to the college football playoff. Guys want to be a part of that. But, keeping the guy – you also have to recruit these kids, right? The kids that aren't your regular starters to stay at Ohio State. Is that how it's working essentially?
Yeah, and you know what? Those guys leave. It can create a depth problem. Ohio State lost, I believe, 3 defensive backs to the portal last year, and they had some depth issues there. And then like you mentioned, Pat, part of the thing is just keeping your roster together. You've almost got to, as you put it, re-recruit them. You've got to make sure that they want to stay and feel like they are welcome and feel like they are needed. Ohio State doesn't want these guys to just walk out the door, so to speak.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you spend so much time recruiting a kid, then developing a kid. Yes, maybe it doesn't go exactly as that kid envisioned it coming to high school, but you don't want that effort to go to waste. I mean, I see him do some things at other schools, and obviously there are certain situations it makes sense for a player to move on. And Ohio State, I think, is perfectly happy with some of them, but I think also you put this much time in a kid, you want to see him flourish in your own program. There's the Joe Burrows of the world, where I think Ohio State was pretty happy with what worked out for them with Dwayne Haskins and then Justin Fields, and they were glad to see Joe excel at LSU. But there are other guys that maybe that's not the right situation. They would have liked them to stay, I think, is the big thing. The last thing I wanted to ask you is any names, people, aside from people we've already mentioned, guys that people should be keeping an eye on for maybe some last minute decisions or flip or sort of things before we kick off what essentially is now new National Signing Day, the start of the early signing period.
Well, I don't think there's a lot of that type of drama right now, but recruiting, it can change overnight quickly. But right now, I don't think there's Jermaine Matthews. I had been saying on our site that there was so much talk about him in Miami, and I kept saying that's not the direction this is going. And sure enough, last night he came out and reaffirmed, as he put it, he's 1,000% locked in. Kay and Lee is a guy that there's been some talk of, and Auburn is recruiting him. They are definitely recruiting him, and the NIL is a factor there. But I feel I've said for a while, I tend to think he's going to stay with his Ohio State commitment, and as of right now, I still feel that way. That he likely will. But he's one that certainly there's been a lot of conjecture over. Noah Rogers is another one. He did stop by North Carolina State last Saturday with a couple of his buddies, teammates, that type of thing, who are committed there. But I still feel like I feel confident that he is going to sign with Ohio State. And Jelani Thurman, same way. I feel confident about him. So, I think all that stuff generally looks pretty good as far as guys that they could flip. Keinholz is the main guy right now that to be concerned with. It doesn't mean somebody won't pop up in the next few days that they try to flip or whatever, but he's the main flip guy right now that we're looking at.
All right, Bill, thanks a ton. We don't do a ton of recruiting talk on the Bucknuts Happy Hour, but I think with everything going on with early signing period starting here, it was a good time to get you in here for the happy hour. So I hope your refrigerator hunting goes well, and I appreciate you taking some time to talk with us.
You're welcome, Pat. Thanks for having me on. Always my pleasure, and keep on doing the great job you do.
All right. Thanks, Bill. I'll talk to you soon.
Okay, take care.
That was Bill Kurlick, our 247 Sports Bucknuts Ohio State recruiting expert. If you're not familiar with Bill's work, he's been doing it, I want to say, longer than anyone in the business. I won't say that sure because I don't want to be wrong, but I can't think of anyone who's covering Ohio State recruiting longer. Bill had stories about an old 800 number that people used to pay to call into, and he would leave information on Ohio State recruiting. So a lot of people do a great job covering Ohio recruiting. Just don't know if anyone's done it as long as Bill, and he does a great job for us. If this is something you're interested in more, if you haven't done it, become a Bucknuts subscriber. Bill has constant updates, not only stories and whatnot and talking to kids, but he's very active on our message board. So if recruiting something you're interested in, I recommend it. The Bucknuts subscription, which the full 247 Sports subscription. Anyway, as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm here in New York for the Heisman Trophy ceremony, which will take place on Saturday night. We don't expect CJ Stroud to win, but he is the first ever Ohio State player to go to two Heisman ceremonies as a finalist. They didn't do that this way when Archie won back-to-back Heisman trophies, obviously. So I will have tons of coverage of this stuff. I've already, as I mentioned earlier, interviewed some of these guys that were for it, and we'll have content coming up on Bucknuts here shortly. We'll have videos from some of the guys if you're interested in hearing what they had to say today, and then obviously tomorrow there will be tons of stuff as well. So stay tuned to Bucknuts. Next week, we'll probably do the happy hour again later in the week. We're supposed to have interviews with Ohio State players and Ryan Day next week. We did not get any more beyond last Sunday from the Buckeyes. I believe it's finals week over at Ohio State, so a busy time. But plenty of coverage. Stay tuned. We were going to talk some Ohio State basketball with Timmy Hall. They had another big win last night, first Big Ten win against Rutgers. We'll do that at some point. We'll dive in once football comes down. But thanks again to everybody who watched this live. Thanks for those of you who are listening to this after the fact in the podcast version. Like, subscribe, all that good stuff. It does us well. And to all you Buckeye fans out there, cheers.